Welcome to another edition of Uncovered. Barrett Sundaresan is not here, but he may be dropping in on Wagon Wheel. He's a rebel. He won't play by anyone's rules. He just wants to appear on random podcasts, not the one that he needs to be on. But he will be back soon. He was actually, weirdly enough, I didn't do Uncovered last week because I found myself in a bit of Australia where there wasn't very good Wi-Fi, sadly. Even worse than my parents' place, if you could believe that. But Barrett was actually available last week, of course. So we've done brilliantly. But this week, plenty to talk about without the big man. We're going to start with, actually, I'll just have a look. I want to talk about Rahane and kind of anchors in general in T20 cricket. There's the new SCG gates. Almost got that out in one word. LIV cricket is something that's quite interesting if you haven't read Breddig's article. There's also how the injuries and the player subs affecting things in the IPL. Matt Roller wrote a really good piece about that. And we've got something on Ireland, Sri Lanka as well. I think, is that everything? Yeah, I think that's everything. That's a lot. You see what I'm saying? There's a lot going on. But let's start with Ajinkya Rahane. As anyone will know, I've been long fascinated with his career. Pretty much, I don't know, was it his first one-dayer where he was up at Durham? I still remember that game for a couple of reasons. That one, I had to drive all the way to Durham for a washed-out ODI game. And the other was how well he batted in those conditions. When that was proper Durham conditions, you know, the ball nipping around everywhere, basically unplayable for batters. And I thought he looked fantastic against the moving ball. You know, cut forward to 6-7 years later, and he's doing that sort of stuff internationally. He's a really fascinating cricketer because of how much he's polarized people. I've talked about this before. In fact, I'm not sure if I've ever put everything together, but it's really fascinating when you look at the fact that he plays in Mumbai and averages whatever it was, 56 when batting in Mumbai. Fantastic player in Mumbai. Then becomes this incredible player of the lateral moving ball in seam bowling around the world in Test cricket, but loses whatever skills he had against spinners in India and becomes very poor. Then two incredible things happen. You know, the wobble ball and the reinforced kookaburra come about, and no one can play seam bowling anymore. On top of that, you also have the fact that in India they're juicing up their pitches for their spinners, which means that again it's almost like the one strength he had is nullified, and the one weakness he had is exacerbated. Right? It's a remarkable set of circumstances to have to happen to one player. And I think it's absolutely fascinating in that way. And as a T20 player, you know, you're not going to get me or many other people ever singing his praises very much. But I've got his numbers here. He says optimistically. Yeah, I've got his numbers. I was just looking at before. Obviously, he hasn't played a lot of T20 cricket, but he had quite a few years where he was averaging, 35 plus or maybe 25 plus is a better way to put it. But between 25 and there was 2015, he averaged 49. The best strike rate he has in any year in the IPL is 137, and that's in 2019. And that is when he made his 100, which I think was about a quarter of his runs that year. So that was a huge boost. But most years you have a look at his strike rate, it's 117, 122, 129, 106, 116. You know, there's like some 130s in there as well. But there's nothing that makes you think that Ajinkya Rahane is a T20 player or is about to be. I think when he got picked up in 2022, I talked about the fact that it's an interesting player to have because as an Indian player, he still has the basic skills to be able to play top quality seam bowling. You know, the fastest bowlers in the world, the most skillful seam bowlers from around the world who all end up in the IPL. You know, you have to play against Rabada and Bolt and Wood and, Jofra and all these sorts of players, Cummins and, I was going to say Stark, but, maybe again one day. But those sorts of guys end up in, Nokia. They all end up there. And there aren't that many players in Indian cricket, domestic cricket, who have the experience, let alone the skill sets to be able to do that. So it made sense. I think he then went on in 2021, he had a strike rate of 100. In 2022, he had a strike rate of 103. In 2020, he had a strike rate of 105. Those are epically crap numbers, right? This year, from 5 games, his top score is 71. He's got 209 runs. So it's not... I'm trying to have a look. If he keeps going at this rate, he'll probably get past the 540 runs, or at least around that period. But it's not an outlier in terms of how many runs he scored. He's averaging 52. That will come down a little. As I said, he averaged 49 in 2015. 2016, he averaged 43. He averaged 40 again in 2012. So he's had a couple of years where he's averaged that. So again, average and amount of runs, not particularly an outlier in either case there. What is an outlier is that, as I said, his highest strike rate so far in his career is, I'm going to round it up for him, 138 is the highest one. So he has never had a year over 140. His current strike rate is 199. Now, we expect that to regress because there's very few players who can ever manage to keep a strike rate over a full season of any competition around that sort of strike rate. Certainly someone who's in his, 100th season of the IPL. He's actually played more IPL seasons than have existed so far. So we expect some regression. But even if he scores at a run of ball from here on in, which he did in the previous 3 seasons, he'd still be looking probably at a strike rate of at least 140, maybe 150, right? And if he fails a lot, perhaps even higher than that. And this comes back to Jimenez's Twitter thread, which he put up a few days ago, which was about anchors in T20 cricket. It's a really interesting little read. And obviously, I've written quite a bit about anchors before as well. And I think for anyone who's done any analysis on T20 cricket, they're kind of the first things that you are drawn to, because it doesn't make sense from a analysis point of view to sort of have anchors. In fact, while I'm here, someone actually asked me a question that I thought was really interesting. Because I'm on my own, if you do want to send through any super chats as well, you can today. But here is it. Rahane says, KL Rahul's strike rate is a concern and he has lost his team 2 games. As an analyst, how would you look to convey such issues with coaches? And please share your experience when you encountered. So there is no analyst I've ever had a conversation with that hasn't had an issue with this. I remember the Islamabad United way of looking at it was that they would tell their team, this is more to do with the chase, which I suppose with KL Rahul. In fact, I'll get back to that game in a minute because it's a really interesting game as well. But in the chase situation, they tell their teams to chase all totals in 18 overs. And the reason is because if you do allow it to get to the end of the game, as KL Rahul found recently, things sort of happen in those last overs. They tell the players, though, that it's a net run rate issue, which it kind of is, if we're being brutally honest. But players don't usually worry about net run rate too late in the year. So Narain's question, which is really, really good, is there isn't an answer that I've come across so far, when it comes to what's the best way of putting it? There isn't a way that I have seen to be able to talk players through. I've had meetings with players. I've had meetings with players' agents. I've had meetings with players' agents, their personal coaches, their entourage, and everyone's telling them the same thing. And the player just goes out in the next game and does it again. It's a really hard thing, I think, for batters who are brought up to put a huge price on their wicket to suddenly think that it no longer matters anymore. There's external factors too. KL Rahul's talked about this, and I think I've done a piece on this before, that, a big part of his thing was he was looking at the batting lineups he was batting with. And I've certainly seen that before when players who are quite explosive get weaker batting lineups, they quite often slow down. And I know that this is something that coaches worry about a lot when they have weak number 6s and number 7s, that, the top order plays slower. There's also, again, something that we've covered quite a bit is that, within Indian cricket culture, there does seem to be there still is this counting runs, interest. Simon Doull and Harsha Bhogle got in trouble for talking about players entering their milestones, but it's not just a milestone thing. It really is the overall total of runs is still something. The fact that the purple cap goes to the player who scores the most runs, and don't get me wrong, the orange cap is just as stupid. And I'm not sure what the better option is there, unless you go to an MVP ranking or, you come up with something very different. But a player who scored the most runs in an IPL or any T20 season may not be the most useful. And so what Jimenez's piece was talking about really was the fact that being an anchor or having the ability to anchor on its own is not a negative for your team. So I've talked about this quite a bit with teams and, in my videos and stuff as well. So you look at someone like Steve Smith. There is a reason to have Steve Smith or Kane Williamson in your team. You don't need to be, one of those freaky Kane Williamson fans to be able to, understand that. It makes sense. Kane Williamson is a brilliant player of spin bowling. He's a brilliant player of pace bowling. He brings a sense of calmness. He can up the strike rate at the end of the game. He does all these massive things. The interesting thing with players like that is that if they are scoring really slow in order to do all those things, they're actually taking away some of their own usage. And I've always thought that if you're going to have an anchor, the best thing to do is to use them as a floating anchor. Does the term floating anchor make any sense? Because an anchor, well, I suppose an anchor by definition cannot float. But what I mean is, let's say you have Kane Williamson, and you bat him at number 3. He doesn't need to come in number 3 in every game. There are certain situations where it would make a lot more sense for him not to come in. And those sorts of guys, Coley, Smith, Williamson, Rizwan, there's heaps of them right across cricket, right? They actually make more sense sometimes coming further down the innings because they've got a bit of a sense of freedom. But also that's when you want very good runners between wickets. That's when you want people who really understand bowlers a lot. That's when you want all those other different things to have happen. So yes, they may not be the power hitters, but they can actually still bring a lot of other things there, and they will be able to find boundaries in clever ways towards the end of that innings. And in fact, most of these players do that. It's just that they take sometimes 40 balls to get to that point. So what Jimenez was saying essentially is what you really want is hitters who can anchor. And that is, if my floating anchor doesn't make any sense, that a hitter who can anchor probably makes even less sense, although not from a boating point of view in this way. And the reason that it makes even less sense is because traditionally that's not how we thought about batting, right? There are, from, I don't know, who would you, I'm trying to think of some of the old hitters, all the way through to Leary Constantine, those sorts of players. They've always been those players who bat at, 6, 7, 8, 9, who can whack the ball, Lance Cans type players, right? They are traditionally hitters. They get their front leg out of the way. They, play across the line. They do whatever their hitting zone is. They do that. And then there has been batters. That doesn't mean that we haven't had batters who could score very fast. Obviously, you have someone like Victor Trumper and Viv Richards. There have been players like that. Even Gilchrist probably fits into that, Quinton de Kock. So there have certainly been players who have the ability to do that. What T20 cricket is really showing us, though, is that hitting, the ability to hit the ball is the far more lucrative skill to have, right? The anchor skill, you only need maybe 1 in 3 games. Whereas the hitting skill, you probably need in all 3 games. Because even if you're anchoring, at the end, you still need to be able to hit. And so there needs to be a readjustment of how these players kind of think about their entire game. And the interesting thing about that is that perhaps we have Rahane doing that right in front of our eyes. And he's not even the only player doing it, because I've just done a huge video on Faf du Plessis, who I think has got better since I made that video. But I planned that video before this year because I could already see what was happening with him. He's trying to do a similar thing. You could see that he's still, and both of those players are, obviously, they're both absolute international quality players, but neither of them were greats. And neither of them were even national greats when it came to their core skill of batting. They had other skills. They were both fantastic slip fielders, for instance. Gully fielder as well, in Rahane's case. And Faf was a brilliant outfielder when he was younger as well. Like, probably still a brilliant outfielder, but not quite the levels he was when he was 24, 25. But there's those sorts of players were not quite at that top level, but obviously international quality players, over a long period of time, even if they had to work harder at it than obviously some of the more skilled players. They both have been poor at times in their T20 career. The Faf stuff is in that other video. Rahane, I've just gone through the numbers. But they are also players who are very good at adapting to new situations and keeping themselves relevant. Rahane probably, if Rahane wasn't giving leadership advice, if he wasn't an excellent fielder, if he wasn't very good away from home for such a long period of time, just is out of that Indian side in a heartbeat. Faf as a T20 player, as I've talked about, has done a similar thing. Even if you look into him as a test player, they're probably more talented natural batters than Faf around that South African setup when he was there. He had almost like a Michael Vaughan career. He had that, brief little period where he was absolutely brilliant. The rest of his career, he really, really struggles over a long period of time. So they are looking at this, and I would say both of them are thinking the same thing, but this is where my money is. International cricket is now gone. What do I need to do? It's really interesting that both are pressing the accelerator so hard at the moment. But what that shows when you've got two players who are beyond their best as batters, we know that from the rest of their international cricket, right? You could argue that Faf is maybe having a late prime. That's fine. I don't think you can argue that with Rahane, looking at all of his stuff, right? And yet here they both are. And I think what it shows, and to go back to Jimenez again one more time, is that there are a lot of batters out there of a similar quality to these two players, and even of a slightly lesser quality, and even of a slightly higher quality, who could do the same thing. It really, a lot of it is about mindset. The whole intent merchants, and people get very upset with that, and the commentators use it as a clutch sometimes. I'm trying to think, there was a game the other day where Jason Roy and Hayden was coming out with talking about intent. Well, he just tried to hit boundaries. Like, that's kind of what he was supposed to do in that situation. It wasn't that his intent did anything. It's just that he came out not trying to chip the ball around. So I understand why people get a little bit upset with intent. But the point is that I think international batters and top T20 and franchise batters around the world, I think they do have to start thinking of these things a little bit different than they have before. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to watch all that sort of play out this season. And the other thing is, it's not the only thing that Faf du Plessis has been involved with that I think is quite interesting. I haven't followed the Impact Player Sub as much as other people. I don't know, maybe I still have PTSD from the Super Sub rule. And anyone who's been on these podcasts before and listened to them knows I just want us to get to the point where we have 4 or 5 proper subs, and cricket completely opens up. If that's what we're going to do, if that's where we're going, especially in T20 cricket or in Test cricket, as I've said before, that's where I want this to go. But Matt Roller wrote a really interesting piece about the fact that RCB have used their player sub in a very, very interesting way, which is to have your have your injured players basically play a bigger role. So Harshal Patel can't bat at the moment because of his finger, and so they're playing him purely as a bowler. Faf obviously can bat at the moment, but he's struggling a little bit with some injuries, and so he can't run around the field as much. And so they're just interchanging them. And I've heard a lot of people say things like the all-rounders will be devalued. I still think that having a bat, especially when there's only one sub, having all-rounders who can bat at number 8 or number 9 is still going to help teams. So I don't really think it's as devalued as people think it's going to be, but it's also quite interesting to watch these two do it. So I think that's been very, very fascinating. I will take a break here. Thank you to Noreen for that question. I will take a break here, and I will have, and I'll come back, and I want to talk about that LSG collapse, because I watched it again on replay the other night, and it was fascinating. But first, let's do this.
Our next partner is Athletic Greens. If cricket has taught us anything, it's that green things are good for you. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens every day. I gave AG1 a try because a while back I was stuck in a studio reporting on New Zealand, England on overnight. When those games weren't on, I was up early watching India, Australia at around 4 a.m. In between afternoon naps, I had to watch the Women's World Cup. And when all that was finished, I was doing early mornings for Bangladesh, England. Ignoring the fact that there's too much cricket, that's a stupid schedule for a human being as well. And so Athletic Greens was a far better alternative to ice baths. And after taking it, I felt a lot better. In fact, the whole thing probably kept me sane and healthy at the same time. And also being the kind of nutritional drink I needed to survive those hours, and also the 2 a.m. biltong binges I did a few times. Look, I am not going to pretend I have a balanced diet. So Athletic Greens is how I cover the nutritional basis. 1 small scoop of AG1 with water, and I drink it first thing in the morning each day. Done. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then Athletics Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and also 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/Inca. That's the Inca from the end of my Red Inca podcast. So athleticgreens.com/Inca. Check it out now because it is the best screen top you'll ever invest in.
All right, welcome back to Uncovered. Jarrod Kimber flying solo. Flying? Am I flying? Not sure which way. Oh, at least the Wi-Fi's better. I've got my old cameras here. I've got my favorite microphone. Things are good. I just want to go to that LSG game that I was talking about before. So in that game, what did they need? Was it 35 runs with 9 wickets in hand and 6 overs, whatever it was, whatever the easy chase was in that particular game. And quite often when that happens, we blame the chasing team, which is fine. They're ahead of the rate for most of that game. And actually, when you have a look at it, more often than not, it's because the team hasn't got far enough ahead, and it's a game in which the ball's getting very soft on the surface, and it's making it very hard for people to time it, and the run rates go down. And so I sort of saw that game a little bit. I'm trying to remember where I was. I'm trying to remember if I was watching it on a plane or something ridiculous. But wherever I was on the 22nd, maybe I was back in the UK by then. But I watched that game and saw it. And my first thought was that the sting had gone out of the ball. But the best way to tell that is, of course, to go to the worm. And is it the worm or the other one? It's the other one, not the worm. I forget what they're all called now. Oh my God, I can't find it. But yeah, so the other one. And when you can go into that, and you can see what the run rates were per over for each team. You can see that Titans actually, was it Titans? Yeah, it was the Titans. You can see that the Titans scored fine at the end. In fact, I think their run rate went slightly up for overs 18, 19, and 20. So what we saw was an old-fashioned fluke loss. A collapse in T20 cricket. We see them, every now and again. And, we've already had one question talking about KL rule from Rahane, talking about KL rule and the strike rate. And so, you certainly then have a situation where he gets blamed for that, and that's more than fine. But the other thing is, it is worth talking about, and I've talked about this a little bit. In fact, you can go back to when I was talking earlier. If you let the game come to the end, and I've written a whole piece on this, maybe 2 IPLs ago, it might have been the World Cup, about once you get to the last over, the last overs are very, very crazy in T20 cricket. They are almost a different form of cricket altogether. So Rahul goes out, and that's absolutely fine. He'd made a lot of runs. He got them to the brink. They had Stoinis to come in. Stoinis goes out next ball, and then the following 2 balls there are run outs. And this comes back to the game where there was 5 sixes in a row, whatever it was, to finish the game. And people say things like, "Oh, it's amazing that he's hit these sixes at the end of the game." And it's like, no, it's not. Because that's probably the only time in the game you are ever going to be trying to hit a 6 off every ball. And it's a bit the same with this collapse. This is probably the only time of the game where you're going to be running for everything, where Marcus Stoinis is not even going to give himself a ball. I remember talking to Dan Christian, who's like, I suppose, one of the world's leading experts of batting between numbers 5 and 8 in T20 cricket. And I was saying, do you have to go from ball 1? And he said, you just can't. He said, some days, obviously, you're seeing the ball well, or they bowl a poor ball. He said, but you have to take a ball or 2 more often than not just to get yourself in. So in this particular case, you've got panic, you've got miscommunication with new batters coming out that haven't run with each other. So that sort of 4 wickets in 4 balls kind of collapse is actually something that happens quite a bit. If you go back to, I want to say Jason Holder took 4 wickets in the last over against England. I think that's right. In a T20 at home a couple of years ago. I think I was commentating on it. And again, there was this, shock and, oh, wow. But it's like those sorts of things actually happen quite a bit in that last over, because it does go into a particular kind of game that the rest of the T20 game isn't like. And so you do get those extreme things, and they're actually far more common. That's not giving LSG a free pass. They should have won the game, and of course they should have. But sometimes you lose games that you should have, and all those sorts of things. But it is very, very interesting to have a look at all those sorts of things. If you want more notes on the IPL, we've just done our latest power rankings, which are already on the site, and you can have a look. Just to move on, the SCG has announced that on the, I think it's Tendulkar's birthday, and also the 30th anniversary of Brian Lara's knock at the SCG, that they're naming the gates there on the ground the Tendulkar Lara gates. For those of you who don't know, Lara made 277 at the SCG, and he also named his daughter Sydney in homage to his favourite innings, which is something for him, being that he made a couple of other pretty good innings along the way. I think the running joke, I think it was Dean Jones's, but it could have been anyone's in cricket, because I think everyone's retold this joke at this point. But it was good that he made those runs in Sydney and didn't name his daughter Lahore. Tendulkar as well, I think he averaged something like 150 in the SCG. He made that incredible 100 where he took away the cover drives there, which I've discussed before, by the way, on a video about Virat Kohli and cover driving, which is probably worth looking up if you're interested. It's very interesting. Those two players were obviously both fantastic players of spin bowling. Not that they were either particularly bad against seamers as well, but fantastic against spin. In those days, it was a very batting-friendly surface, and it was very spin-heavy. You know, teams would often take two spinners in. Alan Border took, I want to say, 11 wickets in a game against the West Indies, and took about another 15 wickets in his entire career. And so there was certainly, at that stage, it was made for those sorts of long innings by those absolute champion batters. But they were fantastic in different ways, those innings. I think they were absolutely fantastic knocks. You know, lucky enough to have seen both of them. But also, I just want to say the SCG, I think the SCG is a much better ground than a lot around the world at just honouring its own cricket history, or its place in cricket history. And I think there was some eyebrows raised when, you know, when these gates were made and weren't given to a home player. In fact, I'll talk about the home versus away thing in a moment. But the SCG, as you know, I've been to a lot of grounds in the world, and you know, my favorite one is Kensington Oval in Barbados, where everything is named after a player, just because they've had so many great players. They've tried to fit them all in. But there's a lot of grounds in the world that just don't really honour their players' history, cricket's history, cricket that has been played there. You know, one of my favorite things at the MCG is that they have a banner of the, I think it's the highest one-day score. No, I think it's the highest. It's a test scores. It's the highest test score for a home player, highest test score for an away player, and best figures for home and away players as well. So I think Viv Richards was replaced by Alistair Cook. I think that's right. But even then at the MCG, it kind of feels a little bit buried away. There's something about the SCG and the way that it is put together that it's front and center. But a lot of these grounds around the world could do a lot more when it comes to showing their part in cricket history. And it's certainly something that I've noticed over the years that is a little bit lacking. But the other thing I want to talk about is Australian cricket. As someone who grew up there, I found one of the biggest problems with Australian cricket always was the lack of, I don't want to say respect, because that's the wrong way of putting it, but the lack of admission that, you know, great players from overseas played a part in Australian cricket being what Australian cricket was. And what I mean is, you know, Larwood is a perfect example of that kind of thing. You maybe add Jon Snow as a sort of a random player. These sorts of players who came over, and Lara and Tendulkar, certainly two of those. Imran Khan would be another one who had a huge effect on Australian cricket, and they're not always honoured in the way that they should be in that way. And I've talked about this before. The way that cricket is marketed, it never makes sense to me. So when a test series is coming up, you know, when South Africa were at their best, I was just like, every country in the world should just be marketing Dale Steyn. How will our men stand up to Dale Steyn, right? You know, and really, really be pushing that angle, and, you know, showing replays of Dale Steyn knocking people's heads off and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, it could be the same for other players. And it's one thing that I think that the world of cricket hasn't always been good enough at, which is that ability to, I'm trying to think of it the right way, that ability to market cricket as a sport between two teams. It's basically marketed as your home team is playing, maybe occasionally with England, India, and Australia as a slight variation. But, you know, if New Zealand is coming to play your team, you should be marketing, you know, when New Zealand's bowling attack was incredible, you should have been marketing that. How will we go against the world's best seam bowling attack, right? You know, those are the sorts of things that you should be using. Use the opposition star power and build up the narrative beforehand. And I think that's really lacking. And I'm not saying that the SCG gates completely change are a step in the right direction. I still think that cricket's a little bit backwards in the way that it does this. But I do think that that is something going ahead that cricket boards for international cricket surely should be doing. Weirdly enough, it kind of feels like the IPL is quite interesting because there is an element of, was it Kohli who was captaining the game the other night, and the opposition team put up a tweet about how great it was to see him captaining again. That's not how I would have written it, but I thought that was an interesting thing. And, we're seeing similar things with Dhoni and everything else. The IPL seems to be a little bit better in that, just maybe because these are such huge legends throughout India, that it's different. But Tendulkar and Lara were huge legends in Australia, as was Curtly Ambrose, as was Wasim Akram, as was Imran Khan. There were lots of players who were, legendary, but they weren't used as much in the marketing to build up the hype. And I think it's a real missing trick within sport, our sport, cricket. Let's take another break, and then after the break, I will briefly talk about Ireland and Sri Lanka and what I saw of that game today, and a little bit about LIV cricket, and then I will get on to your questions. But first,
if you like what we are making here and you want to know if you can help out, well, you can. On top of asking super chats on our lives, you can also support us through Patreon or buy me a coffee. The more support we can get, the better and more videos we can make. On Patreon, there are plenty of other things we offer too, like a Discord server, the chance to ask questions directly, AMAs, and early versions of our recordings. This channel only exists because people like you help support it. We have to buy equipment, software, pay wages, and my mortgage, I suppose, just to make this stuff happen. And if you don't have any money available to spend, it isn't just your money we want. Shares, likes, retweets, comments, subscriptions, the little bell icon thing, all of it. They help us build and become more professional, make more videos, better videos, all that sort of stuff. So thank you for watching everything we make and for all your support so far.
all right, welcome back to Uncovered. Jarrod Kimber today. I'm going solo. Ireland, Sri Lanka. So I think Ireland have done really well on day one. I'm trying to think, but probably by the time the actual audio podcast is out, maybe day two, so they might have collapsed. But I thought they batted really well. It looked like a decent wicket to bat on, but I still thought that they looked a little bit more assured than a team that really hasn't played a lot of Test cricket. Probably had any rights to look. Balbirnie, probably very disappointed not to get his 100. I was watching it quite intently at that stage. He just started to play for the landmark, perhaps. It'd be interesting because Andy's really, really honest. We've obviously had him on the podcast a couple of times. It'd be really interesting to see if he agrees with that. But just looking at him, there was a ball that was bowled. I think it was Fernando coming around the wicket to him. That was a length ball, probably missing leg stump. And Andy sort of got almost inside of it to defend it back up the wicket and gave it way too much respect. And it was at that stage I thought to myself, I wonder if he'll make his 100. And then, of course, he didn't, certainly after. Special shout out to my man DDS, Danajay De Silva. If I had a collar on, I would put it up at this stage. Brilliant slip fielding. Probably all throughout this series. I'm trying to think of how many slips catches he's got. It feels like he's got quite a lot. And in varied ways as well. But man's a legend. The other note I had from that game, of course, is Lorcan Tucker. I'm watching him today again. It is just incredible how quickly he has grown as a player. I would have thought that even if he could have ever got to this level, which I don't think I saw, well, I definitely didn't see in his future. I saw him as a really handy number 6, number 7, plucky sort of 35 average guy. He looks at the moment like he could do a lot more than that. And in white ball cricket, probably 25 average with hyperactive strike rate. Again, looks like he could do more than that. But just watching him again today, just how quickly he has gone from a bits and pieces player, even on the fringe of, not a particularly good batting lineup, to probably the best player. I mean, Tector and Balbirnie might be more technically sound at the moment. I'm not sure if they're better. I'm not sure if opposition teams worry about them as much. And Paul Sterling, who's a fantastic cricketer, obviously probably in the end of his career. But Tucker has just come from absolutely nowhere. Really enjoyed watching him again today. That sort of counter-attacking style. but counterattacking in a way where he's in control of it. And that's the difference for me. I think that's why I thought he was a limited player, was even when I saw him bat good before, I always felt he was out of control and not quite on top of what he was doing. You now watch him and you do think, he's got the ability to attack, to be freewheeling, but also completely in control of every movement he makes. I cannot be, more excited by him. I might end up doing a big video on it. I don't know how I have managed not to at the moment, but he's a fantastic player. And it's a pleasure to watch him make runs again. Now, what else? Oh, yeah, just the last thing that I had on my notes, which I think is quite interesting. Dan Brady's done a big special on the IPL for the Age newspaper in Australia. And in the 4th episode, he talked about LIV cricket. I think I might have mentioned this before because it's something that made a lot of sense to me. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's an article a year or so back where Greg Norman talks about IPL cricket. And he was sort of talking about the fact that with LIV Golf, they were trying to do what the IPL had done. And I, reading between the lines, thought that he thought that Saudi Arabia could get involved with T20 cricket as well. Which is not that much different to what Major League Cricket is doing, right? It's a very similar kind of thing. So I thought that was fascinating at the time, and obviously that's gone on to be even more fascinating now that there is certainly a plan there that has come out. But for those who don't understand, so LIV Golf is a rebel league. So when we call things rebel leagues, we do make them sound slightly sexier than they do. Like we call the players who played in apartheid South Africa rebel players. But it's an illegitimate league, I suppose, in that it is not one of the major golf leagues. It has come up into, it's a different kind of format. They play less golf. They have played all their players, so they don't really play for prize money as much as they used to. They more play for, it's the best way of putting it, they are almost playing more like, paid more like wrestlers, I suppose. And I don't mean that in a way that the golf is fixed, but I mean that they're getting appearance fees, and that's where the majority of their money is coming from, which is not the case with them playing in a normal golf tournament. Although a lot of players still get appearance fees. But in this case, the appearance fee is the reason that they are playing, and they're obviously getting hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases to play in these leagues. And so it has upset golf. You would say that, the PGA Tour in America was asking for this. They probably haven't treated their golfers as well as they could have. They've got a very bad reputation with the golfers. There's a documentary called Happy Gilmore that you could watch that talks about this. But it was a bit of an unsexy environment, PGA golf, and golf has really struggled in the last couple of years with that whole generation, my whole generation of people between 35 and 50 probably, who grew up with golf being the sport that you played as you got older, don't play golf anymore. A lot of them went to cycling and wore those really horrible shorts in cafes that you might have seen. A lot of them still, now that everyone's younger, even when they're older, and keeps their body better, some people just continue to play the sports that they've always played, even if they play them at a slightly lower level or whatever else. And I don't have as many friends who've retired to golf, as what used to happen. And so it is, I think, a little bit of a different environment for golf. And so golf was probably ripe for a couple of things. One is that the golf audience is an incredibly obsessed audience. They will pick up almost, the people who really love golf. So for those who don't know, cricket's a little bit different in this way. There are a lot of people who play recreational cricket around the world who don't really know that much about the international or T20 franchise level game. It's really fascinating when you speak to people who play cricket. They quite often don't know that much about their teams. They don't follow that much, but they play cricket every week. Then, of course, you have the people who are massive fans of their local team. And then you have the sort of hardcore people like on this channel or on Cricinfo who are huge fans of cricket all around the world. Golf seems to have more of that hardcore audience than cricket does. There are no really, I'm not saying you can't support, if you're Korean, you wouldn't support your local golfers, but it's a slightly different sport. It's not as nationalistic as many other sports. And because of that, the people who seem to play it a lot seem to also watch it a lot. And so there's this huge industry out there. And the actual industry around golf, even as golf has struggled, even as golf hasn't found as many new members, even as golf is seen as uncool, all these sorts of things, is that the industry around golf has still been quite strong because it is a lifestyle choice, right? In a way that being a cricket fan is not really a lifestyle choice. And so there's a lot built into that whole golfing culture. So with that in mind, if you can put together the best 20, 25, 30 golfers in the world, play them on beautiful, specially made golf courses in Saudi Arabia, you can get a fairly decent audience in. That's what LIV Golf is. The reason the Saudi Arabia are looking to do this is obviously they've already been involved in football, they've been involved in golf, they've been involved in Formula One. They are trying to sports wash their image. They have a particularly bad image around the world. I don't think there's that many people who are pro-Saudi when you look at the governing of that country and the royal family and everything else. So they're doing what a lot of countries have done before. The interesting thing with golf is that golf is kind of a conservative sport. It's even maybe more so than cricket in certain ways. And so for it to be sort of wrestled away from, the governors of the game and given to Saudi Arabia has caused a lot of problems. That's LIV Golf. And that's where we are. I actually was interviewed because I wrote a huge piece on Greg Norman, which I know maybe one day we'll try and turn into a video essay. I might even, I've talked to Greg before, I might even be able to get him onto the thing, especially if he's involved in this LIV cricket thing. But because I'd written this big piece, I was interviewed by him, about him, by a woman who was writing a big feature on him a while back. And she was sort of saying that, why doesn't he just admit that Saudi Arabia is terrible and he shouldn't be taking their money? And in the last few days, someone in Australia was talking about LIV Golf and was talking about what I was telling this woman, which is that the first thing you need to know is that a lot of athletes are not politically on, they're not politically left, but they're also not politically savvy on left or right issues. There aren't that many cricketers who know that much about politics. They don't follow politics that much. So that's the first thing that you need to know. Then the second thing you need to know is that a lot of these athletes have taken money from very, very random things. Have a look at how many people in cricket have been taking money from crypto companies. Now, I'm not saying all crypto companies are scams and that the whole system is a scam, but it doesn't feel like it's a great system. Look at how many cricketers took money from NFT companies and promoted NFT products, right? Supplement products, alcohol, betting, all these sorts of things that you could argue are also not particularly good for society. Now, you can argue that what Saudi Arabia does, because it's state sanctioned, is far worse than everything else. But I've had discussions with high-level cricketers about people they have dinner with, about companies that they take money from, about deals that they do, products that they spruik. They don't think about it in the same way that we do. And so I find that the whole thing about Saudi Arabia is very, very interesting in that as long as it's something that's already accepted within your sport, you can take money from. But if it's something that's not, that is still dodgy, then it causes a problem. But a lot of this is just that the PGA specifically is upset that Saudi Arabia have come in and bought their best golfers, right? So let's go back to cricket. It's a very, very tough thing for Saudi Arabia to get to the same point with cricket, only because the BCCI has already actualized their money in a way and capitalized on it in a much better way than the PGA did. That said, when the international cricketers, when there was a rebel league that was being looked at, which was the ZTV owner, Lalit Modi and Dean Kino, when they were sort of involved in this rebel league, we know that David Warner was offered $50 million and that he was thinking of accepting that. If you went to a bunch of the best players in the world now and you offered them $100 million contracts, $150 million contracts, which is what we know in LIV Golf, that's to let's say the top 20 players in the world, what percentage of those players would say yes? I would say huge, not all of them, because we've seen even in LIV Golf, not always everyone accepting that, but we've seen a lot of people accepting that kind of money. They would have to play a lot more cricket. There's also the whole idea of playing cricket in Saudi Arabia, which may not be everyone's cup of tea. I know, I probably prefer not to play cricket there for a long period of time. As someone who was an analyst in UAE cricket, in UAE, it's bloody hard enough, sitting on a laptop. I can't imagine, having to play in those conditions over and over again. There'll probably be air-conditioned stadiums and everything else, because that's the way of the world now, as we saw in the Football World Cup. But there will be issues there. There will be issues about how much time people want to spend in Saudi Arabia. The UAE, I personally don't like spending any time in the UAE, but a lot of cricketers do. Maybe they'll just see it's an extension of that. But on a money thing, if you are looking at paying, I don't know, let's say to do a good league, they need 150 players, right? Just random number, 10 teams, 15 players a team. And you offered the bottom tier players 500,000 to $1 million, and you offered, let's say you top 10 to 20 players 50 to 150 million, and then you offered a bunch of other players anywhere between that sort of 1 million and 10 million amount. That's really interesting numbers once you start to get into that sort of stuff. How sustainable is it? Does it cause a rift? How many players say no just because they want to continue to play international cricket? Can you still play international cricket? How does it affect the IPL? How does it affect the BCCI? Can they match those numbers? It's an absolutely fascinating one going ahead, and I think cricket will probably be the next sport to be doing something along these lines. Anyway, it will be something that I'll look at further ahead, especially if we hear anything else. It may be something that bubbles out, but I think, and I've said this a lot, that I think cricket is very, very I think cricket is in a situation where it is very, very easy to be able to sort of rip it apart and buy it from the outside. And my big question was who was going to have that money. Obviously, ZTV was certainly someone that were looking at that sort of money, but the Saudi government is the place that could do that. It's a fascinating one anyway. Let me just get to a couple of questions, because there's some really good questions in here. And then I will hit the showers, metaphorically speaking. Will sends in a super chat. Will Saudis get more traction with franchise tests? I wouldn't be surprised. So I don't know who they've talked to so far. And if I had a better idea on who they've talked to, I'd be able to tell you this. But I'd be surprised if no one's mentioned this to them so far. I know that there are certainly people and organizations that have looked at doing franchise test model. It's almost been done once before already. And so I do think it's a really, really interesting way of looking at it. Also, from the financial point of view, would you need fewer teams because of the amount of days that people are playing? And then also, is there an ability then to actually tap into a similar audience to the LIV Golf audience, right? Which is an older audience, rather than perhaps the T20 audience was just something slightly different. I don't know. And I don't know if that matters or anything, or how they're thinking about this, but it's very interesting. ING says, hypothetically, if Hardik Pandya had dedicated his career to Test cricket, what would have been his ceiling? I don't know, because I don't know what his ceiling is as a player even now, because I wouldn't have picked him to suddenly turn himself into an anchor 1 year in the IPL. So I think that tells you that he's a well above average level. He's not just a hitter who, a hitter athlete. There's a lot more going on with his cricket than that. I think we've seen that with his captaincy as well at times. I don't see him as someone who had the ability to average over 40 with the bat. But is 33 to 36 reasonable? I think over a long period of time, I would have thought so. Also, probably depends on whether he bats at 6 or 7. It's obviously a little bit easier to bat at number 7. And if he bats at number 7, he might actually have a lower average but a higher strike rate. With the ball, he's probably a 12 to 15 over a day bowler, isn't he? And I know he's a very good canny bowler, but I wonder if game in, game out, he would be impactful. But I think he had the ability to average. I mean, let me just quickly have a look at his. I almost wrote Harsha Burgley there. That's a different person. Oh no, I was already searching Harsha Burgley. It's okay. Yeah, I think let's just have a look. I just want to look at his first class numbers here. Okay, so he's played 29 first class games. He averages 30 with the bat. So yeah, I think a lot of those were played before he had any development there, and he averages slightly higher in Test cricket. So that kind of follows that. So he averages 31 in Test cricket, and with the ball he averages 30 and in 31 in first class cricket, and in Test cricket he averages 31. I would have thought that that probably depends on usage, because I think there's a lot of situations where he's not a particularly useful bowler. And I would have thought that perhaps he becomes a sort of a Shane Watson type bowler. Shane Watson amount of overs, I should say, not similar to Shane Watson, bowling that sort of 12 to 15 overs, but with the ability to be used when you need him. And obviously a fairly good wicket taker, but you would have thought that over a long period of time, his bowling average is probably 34, 35. But maybe like a Ben Stokes 34, 35, where there's an impact there. That's a really good question. ING. Oh my God. Oh, here he is. AJ, how do you think productive individual players from grossly underperforming teams have the will to keep going? Cricket is one of those sports that is a solo team sport, right? You know, I don't know, AJ, if you've ever played a game before, but, you know, I thought some of my best batting performances were probably when I was playing in teams that weren't particularly good at batting, you know, rather than I struggled a little bit when everyone was chipping in. And I think that, you know, there are other players who obviously do the opposite of that as well. But I think we're talking from a batting perspective, I think proper batters just love batting. And I think if you're Shivnarine Chandrapal, Andy Flower, those are certainly people who felt that way. And if you go back to Murali, Hadley, Fazal Mahmood, those kinds of bowlers who are almost one-man bands or two-man bands in some cases, they are just obsessed by getting wickets, right? You know, that is their raison d'etre, if you will, is to get as many wickets as possible. And because of that, you know, they absolutely push themselves as hard as possible. So it is a solo game within a team environment. So I think it makes sense that a lot of those players do that. Couple says, why do people change under MS Dhoni? I think I've talked to a lot of Chennai players over the years, some of which have, you know, just been friends of mine, and we chat casually. One of the things that they said that MS Dhoni was absolutely brilliant at was understanding role players. And not all star players do understand role players. Star players understand star players more often than not, which is why a lot of them don't make very good captains or managers or anything else. And they thought that he had the ability to understand what your absolute best usage was as a player, but also not make you feel like he was limiting your game by doing that. And that's a really tricky little middle ground, because if you're a star player who's gone in the IPL for big money, and he's saying to Moeen Ali, we don't need you to bowl 4 overs again, right? We don't always need you to bat in the top 4 or 2 else. What we need from you, Mo, is when they have a couple of left-handers, we want you to bowl 3 or 4 overs. Other days you might bowl 1 over, right? And then when we need you to hit is going to be specific matchups, you know, specific kind of bowling lineups, you know, periods of the game. But there are other games where you might float back down the order, although that probably hasn't happened as much in Chennai. He has the ability to make people feel comfortable in that, and I think that's really important. The other thing is, because he reads the game so well, I think he's very, very quick to see where a player's best usage will actually be. And I think that is a really, really important skill to have. And it's not something that everyone has. Interestingly enough, like Ricky Ponting, who obviously wasn't as good at the strategy side of things as MS Dhoni, was another player who players who played with him said similar things, right? That he would make you believe that you were important, even if your role was quite small. And he was very good at going, this is what you are going to do, and you're going to be really good at it, and let's push you as far as we can. You know, so there are certainly players who find that. And if you're constantly putting players in a position where you're using them in the best possible light, then they're going to look better. On top of that, he's calm and he sees the game really well. So there are times when the game gets out of control for you, where he has the ability to slow it down and play it the way that you want it to be, that you need it to be played. Mark Needham says, is Devon Conway considered an anchor? I think he has anchor traits, but it probably put him in that sort of David Warner level of anchor, which is that they are long. I'm trying to remember what I called this years ago when I was running for Cricinfo, but they are long batters, so they're not short impact batters. You're expecting them to average plus 35, in multiple years. But you're also not expecting that to come at a strike rate under 145. So that is almost the dream, right? If you have a player who can, make sure that they're lengthening your batting without giving that back in the strike rate. And I haven't looked at his numbers in the, let's have a look. What's Devon Conway IPL? Because a lot of his numbers were pushed because of playing in very, very poor leagues. But yeah, he's averaging 100. He's striking at 143, 145. So I think anything over 140, and that's not to say you can't be an anchor, but I don't think he particularly comes across as a sort of traditional anchor. The anchors that we're sort of talking about are the ones who score it closer to a run of ball for long periods of time and then explode. Whereas Conway traditionally, and I don't know if that's changed, but when I used to look at his numbers, he used to have a very good strike rate all the way through his innings, rather than the explosion at the end. I mean, everyone has the explosion at the end, but less so with him. Where is it? Adityan says, how good a metric is Cricinfo's impact runs and impact wickets? Would you go ahead and pick a team based on it if you were sitting in one of the 10 IPL teams? I haven't looked at the full metric. So when I was there, I thought a lot of their metrics were good, but a lot more work needed to be done. And it was always, obviously Shiva is brilliant, and Gaurav was working there, and heaps of them. I've forgotten the guy who runs it, which is he's going to be annoyed with me, but I'm trying to think. There was about 3 or 4 people that I dealt with regularly back in those days, and I was involved in some of the early impact metrics that they were doing, and I liked a lot of them. But I haven't looked at them enough. I have my own versions. So we've got something coming out soon that we'll be talking about quite a bit. But when we're looking at the MVP years, we'll be looking at things, obviously true economy, which I came up with a few years ago, but also true strike rate, true wickets, and true average. So they're probably all fairly similar. I think we're all trying to get to a point of like contextualizing these things. I certainly think the context is the most important thing when you're looking at these stats and how things go. And then sometimes also looking at the in-season, and versus your teammates. But my memory of some of the Cricinfo things, that it was a little bit too based on your teammates. And I actually think the context is more important when you were doing it. But they're all better than strike rate and average. Even the flawed ones are probably better than strike rate and average, because strike rate and average are so dependent on what part of the game that you are playing in. And I think that, Rabada's not a good example of this, because I think he's an elite wicket taker, even for someone who bowls at the death. But basically, if you're bowling at the death, you're going to take a lot of wickets, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a plus for your team. And I think those are the sorts of things that we are getting much better at understanding, and that's what these metrics are looking at. Tia says, do you think there's scope for mid-season trades? Players like Jayant Yadav, say Kishore, KS Bharat, Kartik Tyagi could all be playing for another franchise. Yeah, I suppose it depends on... I think they should. I think the season's probably a little bit too short to do that, because I think that by the time you decide to make a trade, it's probably already missed the deadline. The one thing I would say is that, and I think I said this when I was asked about it recently, one of the things with trades in the IPL is, let's say you're third, right? And you think you're a leg spinner away from winning. And there's another team with a secondary leg spinner that they're not using. And you've got an extra top order player that you won't need for the rest of the year, right? You trade them away, and then that top order player goes to the other team, and then they get on a run and they end up in the finals, and you end up having to play them. It's really awkward. You are strengthening the other team. And that doesn't always happen quite the same way in some of the American sports leagues, because of the way that these things work. But in this small finals system that we have in a lot of these franchises, the seasons are so short. You're going to go up against these players. It is awkward. I think that once the IPL or LIV T20 gets to like 3 and 4 months, I think we will see trades mid-season. But, as we've discussed quite a bit, trades are not particularly well managed in cricket at the moment. All right, last one from Anav, who says, you've often said that bowlers like Wasim, Warne were great, not just because of their skills, but the novelty factor they had to them. Which skills action do you think future great bowlers will possess? So Kyle Jamieson's a perfect example of this, that most tall bowlers don't bowl full because their deliveries are floaty, but because he's so strong, he has the ability to not float the ball up, which means that he's a tall bowler who can swing the ball. So you've got a template there for a modern player, and maybe perhaps Marco Janssen is there as well. So because the strength of some of these players has changed and the way that we, prepare players, obviously you've got the, Malinga type bowling actions. So you will get those sorts of things. I don't think any of us would have expected someone like Akshar Patel to come along. So high release, wide on the crease, actually spins the ball, but the ball continues to go on straight. Those are the sorts of things that you're looking at that goes beyond just the basic skills of the bowler. Not to say that Kyle Jamieson isn't very skillful, and what Lasif Malinga did wasn't very skillful, and what Akshar Patel does, but it's being completely different from anyone else. I think he's a really, really interesting, subsection. So anyone who is an outlier in any of that sort of way, Muhammad Afan, is a very, very good example of a player like that. Is anyone who has that sort of skill set. So I think the other one will be if we can get a bowler who is, and the height thing is always a massive thing, but if we can get bowlers who are, I don't know, very, very short. So let's say 5'4" or something, but can still bowl at 90 miles an hour with DRS. And the wobble ball and everything that we now know about cricket, is there an ability, if almost every one of their balls is hitting the stumps, that's going to be a novelty, I think, at that pace, with that skill level that we might see coming ahead. Obviously, we'll see more bowlers who have the ability to bowl more deliveries going ahead. So there will be a natural crossover between, a version of like a cross between Bravo and Harshal Patel and Benny Howe, right? And, and then maybe even having some Rashid Khan skills in there as well. Those sorts of bowlers, I think, will come out and will be so different when they first start that they will have a natural advantage over everyone else. The ability to bowl 135 kilometers an hour, but also bowl a perfect leg spinner, on a skill, but also a novelty factor there. So I do think that those sorts of players will come out over the next couple of years. But in truth, I can't really tell you what the next trend will be, because I wouldn't have picked, a lot of the current trends and everything else out there. I didn't see them coming, because you kind of don't. But yeah, I think the DRS one is really, really interesting to me. So the one that I was thinking about would be if you had a spinner who had the ability to really spin the off spinner, but at pace, who was short and could bowl around the wicket to right-handers. With DRS, would that cause a huge problem? Every ball's hitting the stumps at that point. It makes it hard to sweep them because of the skiddy nature of the bowler in that way. Or so I was fiddling around with that kind of bowler recently. But it's fascinating what we'll see next. Just a couple of super chats have come in as well. Let me clear those up. It says optimistically, then he can't find them. Sartak says, what are your thoughts on the part-time coach for Pakistan in a World Cup year? Well, he's not a part-time coach, is he? He's a part-time director of cricket, which I suppose doesn't make that much of a difference, but it's part-time something else. We're doing a whole episode on that very, very shortly, but thank you for your super chat. I talked to Mickey about this, so I knew about it probably before it came out. And I, followed it a little bit. So Mickey and I were commentating. I can understand why it works for him, and I can understand why. I think this is the job they should have given Mickey Arthur when he was there originally. Not that he's not a good coach, but actually, I don't think. It's not that I think coaches are irrelevant, because obviously that is not the case. But I actually think in Pakistan's case, the most important thing was getting the entire system up and running the way that you wanted it to. And I think that with that in mind, Mickey Arthur was in that he knew the system very well and was probably someone who was always going to end up doing something like that. But the part-time element is a worry, and I don't think it cannot be a worry. I think it's a big risk. I think they might have picked the right person, but given him the job in the wrong way, and for the wrong reasons. And all those things bother me, because if you're trying to be more professional and you're trying to, dot all the I's and cross all the T's, as we all like to say, if that's the case, have they done that correctly? And you'd have to say no. But anyway, full episode to come. Oh, you've sent that super chat twice, Sarthik. So I'm going to put you up. I'm going to mention you twice for that. And thank you very, very much. And hopefully you weren't charged twice. But if you were, thank you for the money. Anime Fan says, why have CSK had an uptick this year with a similar cast? Would you class their openers as anchors? Is Rahane's improvement just an intent issue? No, it's not just an intent issue. But I think he's probably spent more time thinking about his T20 cricket in the last year than he has at any other stage in his career, because the rest of his career is finished. I think he's a big reason that they've had an uptick. I'm trying to think back to last year of where they were. That's the kind of thing I'd probably have to go through. They've got, who's the net bowler? They've got, what's his name? Who I might end up doing a video on because I'm fascinated with him. But he's probably not, like he's probably overperformed for the quality of bowler he is. So there is an element perhaps at the moment of form, and these things happen, right? So I do think that there is an element of form that happens with all of that. But I'd need to do a deeper dive, Anime Fan, to really work that one out. But I've been a bit surprised, a bit with you. It's funny, I've had them high in both my power lists. And in both times, I felt like I've had them too high. But then when you look at the results, you're like, it's hard to argue with that. And I think in the latest power list, I thought they did very, very well in what was a tougher part of their schedule. That bodes really well for them going forward. So I just couldn't see anything that suggested to me that I had them too high. But yeah, I think it's what you're asking is a very, very fair thing. And I think, although I've just taken it off the screen, but I do think it probably just needs more analysis, and I haven't had the chance to go into it yet. But anyway, thank you to everyone for coming on and chatting with me today and asking questions. As I said, hopefully Barrett will be back very, very soon. But good to be back home. And, I've got a ton of IPL content to come up, but I've also got some Ireland content. Is that right? Yeah. And I'm watching the Ireland-Sri Lanka game as well. So there's every chance that I'll have something from there. And we'll see how it all goes. But thank you very much. And I'll talk to you again next time.
If you like what we are making here and you want to know if you can help out, well, you can. On top of asking super chats on our lives, you can also support us through Patreon or buy me a coffee. The more support we can get, the better and more videos we can make. On Patreon, there are plenty of other things we offer too, like a Discord server, the chance to ask questions directly, AMAs, and early versions of our recordings. This channel only exists because people like you help support it. We have to buy equipment, software, pay wages, and my mortgage, I suppose, just to make this stuff happen. And if you don't have any money available to spend, it isn't just your money we want. Shares, likes, retweets, comments, subscriptions, the little bell icon thing, all of it. They help us build and become more professional, make more videos, better videos, all that sort of stuff. So thank you for watching everything we make and for all your support so far.